Now, feedback is a gift, and we had some feedback last week from one of the subscribers to say he loved the channel, loved the programme content, but please, please, please change the programme titles because in his words, they're embarrassing. Now, I like that kind of feedback. It's honest and it's useful. So I had a look at them and he was right. They are a bit rubbish. So I've done some new ones. Not massively important in the grand scheme of things, I'll grant you that. But if you've got any strong opinions about it either way, then leave your comments in the comments section below and I'll pick those up later on today. The main point about today's programme is today is Sunday the 16th of December 2018, and that means that the COP24 conference in Katowice in Poland has just come to an end. So I was keen to find out what the Sunday newspapers in the UK have been saying about it all. So I've got a whole range of all the main ones here. I've got the Qualities, Sunday Times, Sunday Telegraph, the Observer and the Eye on Sunday, plus all the tabloids here, plus a whole bin full of garbage that you just throw straight in the bin. So I wouldn't normally do this. It's an absolutely profligate waste of paper, but I was keen to see what coverage the event had got. I've been through every single page of every single newspaper, and there is not only no headlines about COP24, largely because Brexit has overtaken everything that's in every single newspaper, but there isn't even a mention of COP24 in any of the newspapers, with the notable exception of The Observer, which unsurprisingly is the sister newspaper of The Guardian. So I'll just give you a quick synopsis, and even they have only got it on page 4, very, very tiny snippet up here in the top left hand corner. UN climate talks ended last night after a marathon 36-hour session made progress on the rules for putting the 2015 Paris Agreement into action, but put off hard decisions on other substantive issues such as toughening the world's climate targets in the face of stark scientific advice. And it goes on. So I think it's worth reminding ourselves what two of the main speakers at the opening event at Katowice a couple of weeks back had to say. And those two speakers were David Attenborough and Antonio Guterres.
Dear friends, we are in trouble. We are in deep trouble with climate change. Climate change is running faster than we are, and we must catch up sooner rather than later before it is too late.
Leaders of the world, you must lead. The continuation of our civilizations and the natural world upon which we depend is in your hands.
Fairly sobering words, I think you'll agree. And on top of that, if you've been watching the previous videos, you'll know that I've been compiling a to-do list that I wanted Antonio Guterres to take to Katowice as a direct result of the information we looked at in the IPCC special report that came out back in October. So let's just remind ourselves of what those checklist items were. Number 1, agree policies and programmes for retraining and re-employing displaced workers. Number 2, agree international legislation for the eradication of corruption from global technological and economic systems. Number 3, agree mandatory international legal framework for rapid compulsory reduction of carbon emissions that will be signed into statutory law in each nation. Number 4, internationally coordinated implementation of energy storage for greater electrical grid resilience. Number 5, internationally coordinated agricultural and land management policy to include mandatory reforestation legislation in relevant regions. Number 6, coordinated public health education programme in Western industrialised countries to minimise food waste backed by government and food industry. Number 7, coastline management policies in vulnerable geographic locations. Number 8, all nations to immediately implement much more ambitious policy for adapting existing cities towards energy efficiency, as well as new eco-cities in the relevant geographic locations. Number 9, internationally agreed targets for mandatory, rapid and extensive industrial transitional energy technologies. Number 10, a comprehensive international agreement on the type and extent of global carbon dioxide removal methods to be written into the legal framework of each nation. And number 11, this one's a bit aspirational, a fundamental examination of values, ethics, attitudes and behaviours that underpin each nation an agreement on how to move from local to global solutions with a fair and equitable distribution of responsibilities, rights and mutual obligations between nations. 11 actions on a single to-do list. You could say that's a bit ambitious. I was always taught any more than 3 and they won't get done. But that's what came out of the IPCC report. So how did the Katowice conference go? Well, delegates from 200 countries did turn up to discuss all the rules and regulations they'd need to implement to get these carbon emissions down much more quickly than they're currently coming down. The one exception, of course, was the United States. They did send a very small delegation of people to the conference, but they went there to extol the virtues of coal production in the United States, clean coal as they call it. And here's how that went.
It is clear that energy innovation and fossil fuels will continue to play a leading role. Energy access.
Yeah. Now, given the lack of printed word that's available to us this morning, with the exception of the Observer, I had a look at the television sources and the online sources to see what they had reported, because they've obviously got the chance to get information out a bit more quickly. And to be fair to the BBC, they did have a 9-minute report on their world news first thing this morning.
This is what it's all about. Gases released into the air that heat the planet. He was urged to take a bow. But there are questions about what's actually been achieved. The big challenge is that many countries, including Poland, rely on highly polluting fuels like coal. The world is responding to the threat of global warming, but not nearly with the speed that scientists say is needed.
Now, I have to say, like them or loathe them, the BBC, of all the television channels, have been, in my experience, reporting something on climate change just about every day for the entire month of December. And I happen to know that they are also planning a television programme to follow on from Blue Planet, which will be called 2 Degrees, and that's due for release in March, and I believe it'll be narrated by the great Sir David Attenborough again. So I have a feeling that they are ramping up their activity to start building awareness, at least in the British public, ahead of the release of that programme in March. So that's good news and very positive. As well as that, unsurprisingly, the good old Guardian Online have already got up there with their report on their website, which I'll come to in a minute. And I also found a blog by an American organisation called the National Resources Defence Council. And they've specifically focused on one of the main discussion points in Katowice, called Single Transparency and Accountability System. So I'm just going to quickly read you their notes. It says the Paris Rulebook now includes a requirement for countries to 1. Report early and often following approved guidelines. No later than 2024, countries will be required to provide their new detailed report and then to present reports every 2 years. Leadership countries should present their first report much sooner, by 2020. Then detailed national emissions inventories that use the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change guidelines. Report on the key categories of emissions, document all key greenhouse gases and present the most recent data. Number 3, present new data to track progress against a country's target. Combined with the national inventories which provide up-to-date actual emissions, countries are required to measure progress against key indicators for meeting their national targets, i.e. CO2 emissions against a national CO2 target, and to project detailed emissions trends for where their emissions are likely headed. Number 4 is the evaluated by technical experts and a multilateral assessment. So the biennial reports will be subject to detailed reviews by independent experts, including in-country reviews. Countries will be required to participate in a public multilateral assessment of their progress, where other countries can ask detailed questions and receive specific responses. And then climate finance to support developing countries. On climate finance, countries reaffirmed the urgent need to scale up climate finance, including from the private sector, and to increase finance for adaptation and to align financial flows with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. A climate finance target for 2025 was agreed that starts at $100 billion a year as a floor. Countries decided to leave any decisions about raising the level of climate finance to a later decision date. Developing countries will report on their financing needs for implementing their NDCs. And it concludes by saying clear signals that countries need to urgently strengthen their actions. COP24 apparently sent a clear signal that going forward countries must initiate and complete an inclusive national process to step up the ambition of their climate target. Starting immediately after COP24, countries must go home and begin or finalise a national process that includes participation from civil society, states, provinces, cities and businesses to strengthen their national climate target, which is actually what I thought they'd already started to do after Paris 2015. Anyway, leadership countries should come to the special summit convened by the UN Secretary General in September 2019 and announce their more ambitious climate target to the global community. These revised targets need to show that countries are serious about delivering on the Paris Agreement targets. So that's a sort of positive spin from the National Resources Defence Council. Not quite so glowing from The Guardian. I think it's worth reading that out. It's very small writing, so I'm afraid I need my glasses for this one. The Guardian's view. Countries thrashed out the complex details of how to account for and record their greenhouse gas emissions, which will form the basis of a rule book on putting the Paris goals into action. But difficult questions, such as how to scale up existing commitments on cutting emissions in line with stark scientific advice, and how to provide finance for poor countries to do the same, were put off for future years. In the final hours, agreement was held up by a debate over the market in carbon credits awarded to countries for their emissions cutting efforts and for their carbon sinks such as forests which absorb carbon dioxide. Brazil wanted an amendment that would benefit the country for its large rainforest cover, but this was opposed by others as it could allow the double counting of carbon credits, undermining the integrity of the system. This question has now been pushed back to next year's annual conference. Brazil's stance, however, under incoming President Jair Bolsonaro, who also rescinded the country's offer to host next year's talks, man's a maniac, presages troubles to come. Brazil has been a reliable supporter of the annual talks in the past and has worked to broker deals between the developed and developing world. Without that support in future, the talks are only likely to grow more fractious. Even when Brazil's carbon credits issue was postponed, a further obstacle was opened up by Turkey, which wants to be counted as a developing country rather than a developed one. Weary delegates finally filed into the closing session at nearly 10 p.m. last night to hail the compromise agreement. Despite these hitches, the two-week conference, the 24th Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Conference on Climate Change, known as COP24, finally ended in some sort of clarity, at least on some of the key building blocks for putting the Paris Agreement into action. David Waskow of the World Resources Institute said the final deal was a good foundation for countries to go about implementing the Paris Agreement. He added, "It sets the direction of travel and will spur countries to take action. Now countries need to go home and do their homework by increasing their commitments on emissions." In the meantime, let's have a look at what's happened to carbon dioxide emissions. And all of that means that we are currently still on what the IPCC called Representative Concentration Pathway 8.5, which is the business as usual pathway. And let's remind ourselves what that looks like. So essentially what's happened is the delegates in Katowice have finally come to an agreement late last night and put out a statement talking about a rule book that's now in place that countries can follow to go back home and discuss amongst themselves again how to implement these carbon dioxide reductions to enable them to meet the targets they pledged to back in Paris 2015, with a couple of obvious exceptions being the United States of America and it looks like now Brazil under Jair Bolsonaro. In the meantime, the IPCC report that came out back in October has said that we need to halve our CO2 emissions by 2030. And these agreements that were made in Paris 2015 and have been reaffirmed here in Katowice go nowhere near achieving that aim. So it's hard to avoid the conclusion that based on current trends, social and political change is not going to happen anything like quickly enough to get anywhere near achieving those targets. And so we're left with only two options, which are technological changes and market forces. We need technologies that become simply better and cheaper and more effective than what we've currently got. Solar and wind are two great examples that are now coming to maturity and starting to beat fossil fuels on price and efficiency. But there are many more technologies in the pipeline. Now, there's going to be no more programs for the rest of this year from Just Have a Think. We're all going to have a break for Christmas, and I'm also working on a project with a colleague in America, which we're going to present to you early in January. And that will kick off a series of programs about all the technologies that are happening around the world to try to address the issues of climate change and to try and provide alternatives to the fossil fuel industries that are causing the vast majority of the problems we face today. So that's all coming up in 2019. In the meantime, it's just for me to say thank you very much for watching. Thank you for those of you that have been supporting the channel right from the start. We're still at very early stages. It's 8th or 9th month so far. We are starting to grow now. We are pushing up towards that 1,000 subscriber mark. And that's apparently where YouTube starts to recognise us as being a serious channel. I will be keeping my eye on the news over the festive period to see if there are any developments or initiatives coming out, and if anything radical happens, I'll be sure to put that out on the channel. Other than that though, it just remains for me to say Merry Christmas, thank you for watching, and remember to just have a think. See you in 2019.